May 31st, 1889, 3:10 in the afternoon, the South Fork Dam, 14 miles upstream from Johnstown, Pennsylvania. The dam fails completely. 20 million tons of water, an entire private lake built for fishing and boating, release all at once into a narrow mountain valley with nowhere to go but down. The wall of water grows as it travels. It picks up trees, houses, animals, train cars, and an entire wire factory's stock of barbed wire along the way. By the time it reaches Johnstown, 57 minutes later, it is no longer a flood. It is a moving wall of debris, mud, and water, more than 30 feet high in places, traveling at speeds witnesses compared to a freight train. 2,209 people died that afternoon. Some drowned, some were crushed, some survived the water itself, only to become trapped in the wreckage that piles up against the stone bridge downstream. Wreckage that then catches fire, burning alive the people still trapped inside it. And the dam that caused all of it was owned by a private hunting and fishing club for millionaires. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club counted some of the most powerful industrialists in America among its members. Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon, men whose names are still on universities, museums, and banks today. The dam they owned had been altered for their convenience. Its height had been lowered slightly years earlier to widen the road across the top for carriages. Metal screens had been installed across the spillway to keep the club's stocked game fish from escaping downstream. Those screens clogged with debris during heavy storms. An engineer had personally inspected the dam years before the flood and warned the club in writing that it could fail catastrophically. The club's response was to patch the weak spots with mud and straw and continue using the lake exactly as before. 3 things about Johnstown that explain how 2,209 people died for the convenience of a hunting club. The first, the warning that the dam was failing on May 31st, 1889 was real, urgent, and almost completely ignored. A horseman rode down the valley shouting that the dam was about to break. Many residents of Johnstown had heard nearly identical warnings every spring for years, almost always followed by nothing happening. That history of false alarms meant that when the real one finally came, most people simply didn't believe it. The second, the engineer who inspected the dam and warned the club of catastrophic failure risk did so years before 1889 in enough detail that the danger was unambiguous on paper. The club's modifications, the lowered height, the fish screens, happened after that warning, not before it. They made an already weakened structure measurably worse, with full knowledge of the risk already on record. The third, in the lawsuits that followed the disaster, the courts ultimately ruled the flood an act of God, because the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was structured as an unincorporated private association rather than a formal company. Individual members, including some of the wealthiest men in the country, could not be held personally liable under the law as it existed at the time. Not one member ever paid a single dollar in damages to a single victim's family. The South Fork Dam had a long and troubled history before it ever belonged to a fishing club. Originally built between 1838 and 1853 as part of a state canal system meant to connect Pittsburgh to Philadelphia, the dam created a large reservoir. Lake Conemaugh used to feed water into the canal during dry periods. The canal system itself became obsolete relatively quickly as railroads took over long-distance freight, and the dam fell into a period of neglect under various owners through the 1860s and 1870s. In 1879, a group of wealthy Pittsburgh businessmen purchased the dam and the lake around it. forming the exclusive South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Membership eventually grew to include some of the most powerful industrialists in the United States, men whose fortunes were actively reshaping the American economy at the time. The club's purpose was simple: a private, scenic retreat in the mountains with a stocked lake for fishing and boating, accessible by a short train ride from Pittsburgh. The modifications the club made to the dam, while individually small, compounded into a serious structural problem. The dam's height was lowered by approximately 2 to 3 feet to widen the roadway across its top, allowing carriages and the club's members easier access by land. Decorative iron screens were installed across the spillway specifically to prevent the lake's stocked game fish from escaping downstream and being lost to the club's anglers. Those screens, while serving their intended purpose during normal conditions, created a serious vulnerability during major storms. Heavy rain washed debris, branches, leaves, and other material downstream toward the spillway, where the screens trapped it, gradually reducing the spillway's capacity to release excess water during exactly the kind of extreme weather event the spillway existed to handle. In 1880, businessman and engineer John Fulton personally inspected the dam and wrote a detailed report to club leadership, warning explicitly that the structure showed signs of serious weakness and posed a genuine risk of catastrophic failure if the lake were ever subjected to extreme flooding. The report was received. The recommended repairs were not seriously undertaken. Over the following years, minor leaks in the dam were patched using mud, straw, and other readily available materials, a stopgap approach rather than genuine structural reinforcement. This pattern of minor warnings, followed by minimal action, repeated itself for nearly a decade. Residents of the Conemaugh Valley below the dam, including the town of Johnstown itself, grew accustomed to periodic rumors that the dam might fail during heavy spring rains. Nearly every year, someone would raise the alarm. Nearly every year, nothing happened. That repeated pattern of false alarms steadily eroded the seriousness with which the community treated any new warning. By the 1880s, the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club had become one of the most exclusive private retreats in the country, with membership limited to a carefully selected roster of roughly 50 to 60 of Pittsburgh's wealthiest industrialists and their families. Beyond Carnegie, Frick, and Mellon, the club's roster included other prominent figures in steel, banking, and manufacturing, men who collectively controlled an enormous share of America's industrial output during one of the most consequential periods of economic growth in the nation's history. The clubhouse itself was a substantial, well-appointed building overlooking the lake, designed for extended summer stays rather than brief day visits, reflecting the members' wealth and their expectation of privacy in a setting most of their employees back in Pittsburgh's mills could never have afforded to imagine. In late May 1889, an extraordinary storm system settled over the Allegheny Mountains, dropping what meteorologists later analyzed as one of the heaviest rainfall totals ever recorded over that region up to that time. Lake Conemaugh, already full from spring rains, began rising rapidly toward the top of the weakened lower dam. On the morning of May 31st, club officials and staff at the dam realized the water level was approaching a genuinely catastrophic threshold. Workers attempted increasingly desperate measures, clearing debris from the clogged spillway by hand, even attempting to cut a new emergency channel through one end of the dam to relieve pressure. A rider, sometimes identified in historical accounts as a club employee named John Park, galloped down the valley toward Johnstown, shouting at every town and farmhouse along the way that the dam was failing and people needed to get to high ground immediately. Some people listened. Many, conditioned by years of false alarms, did not. At 3:10 p.m., the South Fork Dam gave way completely. The entire lake, an estimated 20 million tons of water, emptied into the narrow valley below in a matter of minutes, creating a wall of water that grew larger and more destructive as it raced downhill, gathering trees, houses, livestock, railroad cars, and debris from a wire factory along the way, including massive coils of barbed wire that became tangled around victims caught in the flood. Before reaching Johnstown itself, the flood wave tore through a string of smaller communities along the valley, each one giving residents downstream slightly more warning, though rarely enough to matter. The village of South Fork, closest to the dam, was partially destroyed within minutes of the failure. Mineral Point and Woodvale were almost entirely swept away. At East Conemaugh, a railroad engineer named John Hess, working for the Pennsylvania Railroad, spotted the approaching wall of water from his locomotive and made an immediate decision. Rather than uncouple his engine and try to escape alone, he opened the throttle, tied down the whistle, and drove forward through the rail yard with the whistle, screaming, racing the flood to warn everyone within earshot before abandoning the engine at the last possible moment and scrambling to high ground himself. Hess survived. His warning is credited with saving an unknown but significant number of lives among the rail yard workers and nearby residents, who heard the sustained whistle and understood, even without seeing the water yet, that something catastrophic was approaching. The flood wave reached Johnstown approximately 57 minutes after the dam's failure, hitting the city with a wall of water and debris that witnesses consistently described as 30 feet high or more in places, moving with a force and sound that multiple survivors compared to a freight train. The destruction in Johnstown itself was near total across large sections of the city. A particularly horrific element of the disaster unfolded at the Stone Bridge, a massive railway bridge downstream of the main impact, which caught and held an enormous accumulation of flood debris, wreckage, trees, and people who had survived being swept along by the initial wave, only to become trapped in the growing pile against the bridge's stone arches. That debris pile then caught fire, likely from overturned stoves or other ignition sources carried within the wreckage itself, and burned for hours. An unknown number of flood survivors, already trapped and unable to free themselves from the tangled debris, burned to death in the fire after having already survived the flood itself. The final death toll, painstakingly compiled in the weeks and months that followed, through one of the largest identification efforts in American disaster history to that point, settled at 2,209 people. 99 entire families were wiped out, with no surviving member at all. The American Red Cross, under the direction of Clara Barton, conducted one of its first major large-scale disaster relief operations in Johnstown, remaining in the area for months, providing aid, shelter, and support to survivors. The recovery and identification effort in Johnstown stretched on for months, complicated by the sheer scale of destruction and the condition of many bodies after exposure to the flood. The subsequent fire at the Stone Bridge and weeks of decomposition before recovery teams could reach every affected area. A temporary morgue system was established across multiple makeshift locations throughout the devastated valley, with photographs taken of unidentified victims in hopes that surviving relatives or friends might eventually recognize someone. Roughly 700 victims were never identified at all, eventually buried in a dedicated section of Grandview Cemetery overlooking the town, their graves marked simply as unknown. In the legal aftermath, multiple lawsuits were filed against the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club and its individual members, seeking to hold them accountable for the documented history of warnings, modifications, and neglect that contributed to the dam's failure. Courts ultimately characterized the disaster as an act of God, an unforeseeable natural catastrophe, rather than the result of negligence, and ruled that because the club operated as an unincorporated association rather than a formally chartered corporation, its individual members could not be held personally liable under existing law. Clara Barton arrived in Johnstown just days after the flood, leading one of the largest relief operations the American Red Cross had undertaken since the organization's founding 8 years earlier. Barton and her team remained in the region for more than 5 months, establishing temporary shelters, distributing supplies, and helping coordinate the broader rebuilding effort. The Johnstown response became a formative experience for the young Red Cross organization, helping establish operational practices and public credibility that shaped its approach to large-scale American disasters for decades afterward. Not a single member of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, including some of the wealthiest and most influential industrialists in American history, ever paid compensation to a single victim's family. Several members did make private, voluntary donations to relief efforts in the disaster's aftermath. Gestures of charity that existed entirely separately from any formal acknowledgement of legal or moral responsibility for what their dam had done. If you want to understand the disasters where the people with the money and the warning chose convenience over consequence, and the legal systems that let them walk away clean, subscribe. Every week, a story that was hidden in plain sight.